One of the areas that I've been wrestling with is, and maybe it's always been there, but it just feels like there's an increasing resurgence of Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
You talk a bit about this in the book as well. You say Christian nationalism also tends to lend itself to feelings of ethnic superiority and promotes interracial tensions, especially when Christianity is aligned with whiteness.
Yeah.
I've come across this with the immigration debate, which is a huge electoral issue in the UK with the Rwanda bill, in the US with building a wall, and many other parts of the world. And I've met many Christians who are saying, we really don't want to dilute our Judeo-Christian heritage, having all these people come in. They're trying to establish some form of caliphate here. They'll undermine democracy, and we really need to build stronger borders. So I've heard that line, a kind of Christian nationalism line, and then the opposite is, well, God doesn't believe in borders. We should have open borders, and people should be able to go as they want. I'm imagining you might take a third way, but help us wrestle with that.
It's a tricky one because, of course, in the first century, there weren't countries in the way that we have them now with borders. And obviously, if you live in the UK, as I have for most of my life, not all, there is a kind of a natural border. It's called the sea. So it's a bit clearer for us. But I was visiting some Christian groups in Bratislava some years ago. One of the people I met told me that his mother had lived in the same house all her life and had been in, I think, 7 different countries during that time, because that particular bit of Central Europe, they've just been redrawing the map and redrawing it again and again and again. There are so many issues there, Chris, as you well know. I was very struck recently reading some stuff which made me go back to the Oxford English Dictionary on the meaning of whiteness itself. I've been banging this drum for a bit now, and I've been pointing out, if you walk down the street and see somebody coming towards you who is actually genuinely white, you ought to tell them to go to a doctor, because that is white. I don't know anyone who looks like that, and probably the only people who do are corpses. So why did we start to use the word white? And the answer is, go through the Oxford English Dictionary. This use of the word to describe people from the Northern European ethnic groups started to be used when people from those areas went to other parts of the world, particularly Africa, and it was natural to say, well, they are black. There was nothing natural about saying, but we're white. They could have said, but we're pink, or we're a mixture of pink and orange and this and that and the other. But to choose white as the designator already plays right into a binary, an us and them, which actually is very naive in terms of geopolitics as a whole, because where do you put the Chinese or the Japanese? Well, they're yellow. Well, are they? Is that a fair designation? And what about South Africa, where you had black and white and coloured? How does that differ? And what about all the different words that we use for these things? And again, as a New Testament scholar, I'm struck by the fact that in the first century, skin pigmentation was not an issue. It was not an issue about slavery. Anyone could become a slave. All you had to do was lose a battle or run out of money or something. And in the Mediterranean world, they knew that there were people of all sorts of colours and so on. It wasn't a big deal. So it's actually quite a modern invention, and particularly we have to name and shame the role of social Darwinism in here, that it was already coming up in the 18th century, the idea that there were different species, and if there were different species, then different humans might be different species. And then you get Darwin's theories full flowering in the 19th century. And people seize on those and say, here we have, so we've got the white race and the black race, or the this or the that. And we need to recognize those for what they are, that they are flat denial of what Paul says in Athens in Acts 17, that God made from one basis, one stock or one blood, all nations to dwell on the face of the earth. And I know that's often been used by people advocating integration, and that's fine, but it's regularly forgotten by Christians who do want to maintain some sort of ethnic or racial profile. I then want to say about Christian nationalism, of course, there could be an issue if you have a country which has maintained a lot of Christian traditions and a lot of implicit Christian observance, etc., whether it's saying the Lord's Prayer in schools or in public places, public celebrations of Christmas or Easter or whatever, if you suddenly had tens of thousands of people from a different basis coming in and saying, we're going to abolish that, then I would want to argue against that, not on the grounds that we're British, so we're above that, but on the grounds that actually this is for the health of the whole. And the other thing, of course, one has to say here, and I knew this very well when I was Bishop of Durham, is that quite a lot of people of different colours and ethnicities who come to the UK come because they have become Christians in a country where that's unpopular or dangerous, and they want to come to a Christian country. So that actually some of our immigrants are people who are precisely flag wavers for the Christian gospel, having learnt it in the fires of persecution in certain countries. So life is much more complicated. Equally, I would want to say, of course, we are a small island. You could fit the whole of the UK into North Carolina in North America. We don't have that much room. We do have a National Health Service, which is already stretched. Every time you get another 10,000 people coming in, sooner or later that's going to take its toll on housing, on health, etc. It is part of the path of wisdom to seek to navigate that wisely and to have some kind of thing, like most countries do, like Canada, for instance, who have a kind of a qualification. Are you going to be able to support yourself, etc.? It's like the old question that fathers of daughters used to ask potential suitors. Are you going to be able to keep this young lady in the style to which she's accustomed? As a father of 2 daughters as well as 2 sons, I feel that quite keenly, actually, that it really does matter. Because if you can't, then somebody else is going to have to pick up the tab. So we can't just assume, oh yes, everyone can come in and we'll muddle through and it'll pay for itself somehow. And we have to be a bit more canny about that, while at the same time, the position I'm articulating is hedged about with several things. But if one just thinks back to some of the great Old Testament passages about the widow and the orphan and the stranger, the one who just happens to have drifted in and come up to our cities and we're not quite sure where he or she is from, but we have an obligation to give special care to them, as we do for widows and orphans. And if we move to a society which says, no, they're marginal, we're going to push them out, then woe betide us. Then it's us who are being deeply anti-Jewish and anti-Christian.
I often use the illustration from our family, where we're an adoptive, fostering and birth family, and my door is bolted shut at night. I want to know who's in the house and who's not. Me being a good father, right, protecting those inside. But if social services gives me a call in the middle of the night and says there are 3 children that have been abandoned, could you help? Of course, the door comes open and in they come. But there are economic limits to my household, aren't there?
Quite.
So I couldn't accommodate 1,000 children because my house stops being a household then. Something of its integrity has been lost. So I don't want a wide open door, but I don't want a bolted shut door either. It's got to be humanitarianly porous. One of the big immigration conversations that I'm in at the moment is around Gaza and Palestine. We were trying to evacuate 5 Gazan children who had lost their parents. They had traumatic amputations, and we in the UK had the medical expertise to try and help, just like we did for Malala. And to my face, Christians who, love Jesus and love the Bible, not all for sure, but, enough, have said there is no way you should help anyone from Gaza. They're all terrorists. There are no civilians in Gaza. I said, but these are children. He said, well, these children are taught to hate Jews and Christians since they're born, and you'll just be harboring more terrorism. And I'm going, wow, when I was a young person, the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda did some terrible things. They drugged boys, forced them to rape their mothers and kill their fathers. But even in that context, people thought, with love and support, we could rescue and redeem these children. But Gazan children are beyond redemption. And I cannot compute what's happened here.
That is very worrying and tragic. I suspect that some of it comes out of a deep sense that some Christians have that it's Israel right or wrong. Certainly in America I've met this, where people throughout their Christian lives have just been taught and believed that God has raised up the present Jewish nation and that it's under threat from all sides and that it's our responsibility as Western Christians to stand up for it. And having lived out there, life is again far more complicated than that. And the Bible does not support the idea that the return of the Jews to the land in the 1940s was the fulfillment of prophecy. This is actually a crucial thing to underneath the debate you're talking about, that so many people still want to say, well, maybe the land and maybe Jerusalem, this is after all where the Lord is going to return or whatever. And I want to say, look, read Romans 8 for all it's worth, and you'll see that the inheritance which Paul is talking about is not one strip of territory, it's the whole creation. The inheritance is the renewed creation. The whole world is now God's holy land. And once we get that into our heads and our hearts, then all these other sub-questions look different as a result. And then, of course, you can say, well, these children are taught from the cradle that the Jews are the enemies, because why are they in Gaza? Why are they in refugee camps? Why are they in refugee camps in Ramallah and places on the West Bank? And the answer is because the Israeli occupation ever since the 1940s couldn't get rid of all of them. A lot of Palestinians went to Jordan, a lot of Palestinians went to America or Australia or wherever, but there were quite a lot left. And so there have been 2 generations born and bred in refugee camps with hopeless situations and with the building of the Great Wall and checkpoints that take you several hours to get through, being cut off from access to your own olive groves or your own water supply, etc., etc. Now, we know all this, and that doesn't, of course, excuse for one split second what Hamas did 6 months ago, whenever it was. However, if you were a child brought up like that, seeing your parents and grandparents being ill-treated and brutalized, it's only too understandable that you might come to hate those who are doing it. And then, of course, the Christian message should be, we have an answer for hatred in the heart. It isn't a quick fix necessarily. With some people it is. But as people discover that they are loved by the God who made them and who gave his son to die for them, their hearts can be opened to find a completely different way forward. And we know this. This is the stuff of daily pastoral life in parishes and all over the place. So, yeah, that's pretty terrifying what you said, and I'm sorry to hear it, but not entirely surprised, alas.
What hope do you want to give those that are just looking at our world and in despair? Could be ecological disaster, nuclear war, it could be further war within Europe, the Middle East kicking off, who knows what China and Taiwan are going to do. I think we're talking to church leaders, I guess, here. If we might be living more in Jeremiah's time than Paul's time, the gospel isn't expanding, in the same speed. We're looking over the decline in the church in some places. How do we live if our ministry is to be in the time of Jeremiah?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's reminding me of when I was at the Lambeth conference in 2008. I was walking from one bit of the meeting to another, and I was right behind a group from Myanmar, and they were talking in quite low voices about whether they knew of any closet Christians in the junta who were running the country. And I suddenly realized, here are my brother bishops, within touching distance of me, who live in a totally different world to the world I live in. And they have to find their way within that world. And we will pray with them and for them and help them if we can. But they're at the sharp end. And people in, whether it's India or China, as we said before, I sometimes wonder if maybe people will emerge from the Chinese Christian church from the last century or so to teach the rest of us lessons which we don't even know yet. A friend of mine who's a Christian publisher in America has said that when he's seen some of the stuff that's coming out of the Chinese church, he said it's as though they've been a kind of a theological Galapagos. They've been like an island developing in their own way, cut off from the rest of the world, but they've had to make their way as Christians and think through what the gospel means. And it may be that the rest of us have a huge amount to learn from them. So we may be in a great time of transition.
Brings us back to migration, doesn't it? The gospel goes from everywhere to everywhere, as someone once said. I love that picture of a kind of Galapagos Islands of preservation of something beautiful that we need over here, and it's not from the west to the rest, but the rest.
And it's like, of course, what happened in the so-called Dark Ages, not that they were Dark Ages, when in a way Ireland became the cradle of civilization. And that card can be overplayed, but there is something to be said for that. The aesthetic as well as the literate as well as the theological and prayerful sense that Ireland was then the seedbed for all sorts of new things that happened. So the task in every context is to be faithful, to be prayerful, to be watchful, and to be ready to take such responsibility as we're given when we're given it. And not to look for, oh, we've got the great solution. We just have to press this button or say this prayer and then suddenly it'll all be all right. God sometimes does do things suddenly, all in a rush. More often it's through this happening and that happening and these things happening and very ordinary Christians out of the public eye doing the extraordinary thing of reading the Bible, celebrating the Eucharist, praying and loving their neighbours. When that happens, you have no idea which way God is going to break out next.
You can clap, Tom.